Welcome back, guys. I am super excited for today's podcast. A little bit off our normal conversation, for good reason. You guys have seen me post before that, being in a business, one of the things that I'm super grateful for about being a business is being able to start to give to areas that I feel called. And this conversation is an area that I have felt called to for a little while since we had kids. Ignored it in the beginning because it's a super uncomfortable thing sometimes to discuss and have a conversation about, but I kept feeling the nudge coming through and felt like I don't really know what I can do or how I can do something about it, but I feel like I need to do something in some way, shape, or form. So I'm here today with Dane from Operation Lightshine. We're going to have a conversation around a topic that people find uncomfortable and is necessary to discuss. So we're going to talk about trafficking, child exploitation, and what are the things that I know a majority of our listeners are women and moms. What are the things that you can do and really to help bring some awareness to what's actually happening behind the scenes. So I'm really excited to have you here today.
Well, thank you so much, Brooke. I'm seriously honored to be sitting here with you. And we have other podcasts and things, and invited as guests to other events. And it's rare that you have people who are proactive with their own community and desire to utilize their own community to be in the mission and be in the fight. And so it's very important. It's important to have partners like you. So I'm thrilled to be here and greatly appreciate you.
Yeah, I'm excited. Well, I don't know if excited is the word. I want to have this conversation.
Sure.
It's not exactly an exciting topic, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Of course.
So can you explain, there is a lot of conversation around what human trafficking really is versus isn't, and child exploitation. I think the two, from my perspective, get confused very often. Could you kind of break that down and really what it is and how we see it?
Sure. So I'll start off by saying that anything that you hear me say today, anything you hear me talk about, and statistics and things like that, are really parroted from subject matter experts that I have been very fortunate to be around. So I don't consider myself subject matter expert, more of an awareness kind of caster, if you will. So I consider myself knowing enough to be able to get conversations going to where if the audience is suddenly more interested, we then bring in the deep dive subject matter experts who've been doing this for 20 plus years. So I've been very fortunate to be around law enforcement, survivors, psychologists, other subject matter experts, other nonprofits who have been doing this for hundreds of years in combined knowledge and around the world, not just America. And so I'm very fortunate for over the last couple of years been able to do that. But just want to make sure that anyone listening and watching that I do not consider myself subject matter expert, only that I have been blessed enough to be around a lot of them.
Yeah.
So with that being said, back to the original question, like really kind of defining what trafficking and human trafficking is. And human trafficking is really the biggest buzzword of our generation, like in the last 3 to 5 years roughly. And then suddenly movies like Sound of Freedom come out that really kind of put it in a Hollywood perspective, and we'll talk more about that movie later on. But it starts to bring about the right questions, because I think if we want to credit that movie to anything, it's that it got people just wondering, like, hey, is this even real? Like, what is this? This is concerning if it is real. And we'll talk about again the realities of that actual portrayal of those things, but it at least did its job in a sense of starting questions and starting conversations that otherwise may not have happened. And so, I think we, go back to the OG days of the movie Taken. It's like that, talk about a real Hollywood movie. And so these conversations have been happening and kind of gaining momentum over the last few years. And with that comes a lot of misinformation.
Yeah.
And one of the hardest parts is it's one of those things that Googling it is sometimes often not the best thing to do, because there's just a lot of bad data, a lot of hyperbole. There's a lot of made up statistics that, quite frankly, this is bad enough that you don't have to make up stuff. Like it's
Yeah.
bad enough. And so what I'd like to do is kind of just give a roundabout perspective of human trafficking and then draw a line in the sand of the difference between human trafficking and child sexual abuse or child sexual exploitation, because those get hybrided together a lot in our world and in what we deal with a lot of the civilian world, and they're very different. One is monetary and one's not, which is wild, right? So like people are like, oh, people are buying children left and right and all these things, and that may be happening in a small number around the world. But one of the biggest problems is the non-monetary side of it, which is even harder to fight. It's harder to combat it because you can't singularly point to one specific bad guy or bad group. It's a vast problem, and we'll talk more about that. But so to give you a few statistics of kind of understanding, so there's an organization, it's a federal organization, it's a nonprofit that partners with the federal government called NCMEC.
Yeah.
It's the National Center for Missing and Exploiting Children. That's really kind of the standard basis for statistics for these things nationally as we know it. Really, there's a few other organizations, but any of them that are claiming to have direct statistics are probably, if they're not quoting from NCMEC or a couple other different ones, I would question them, right? So NCMEC has very good statistics. They have been around for a very long time. And so what they have reported is over the last, I think it was in 2021, yeah, over the year, they received about 17,000 reports of possible child sex trafficking. Okay. So 17,000, and that's in a year. One is too much, right? Like obviously one is too many. But about 50,000 people are illegally trafficked into the US each year, according to NCMEC. So like you look at 17,000 and 50,000, and you're like, okay, well, 50,000 is the overall number that are coming through the border, that are, because everybody talks about the border crisis and wants to point to human trafficking. And yes, that's a thing.
Yes.
But it seems to get a lot of the focus. It seems to where everyone's kind of zooming in and trying to make it political or make it, there's always an agenda, it seems to be.
Yeah.
And so in those numbers, with that 50,000 that have been illegally trafficked into the US each year, there's really kind of three versions of trafficking. There is actual sex trafficking, which usually gets the most attention. That's a pretty big number of those that are being sex trafficked. Labor trafficking is another one, which is actually pretty huge here in the US. It's still pretty shocking that that's so common. And then there's debt bondage, which would be like somebody that, you owe a certain amount, they pull you in, they make you work for a very long time to pay off that debt. So like those are the three primary types of trafficking that kind of law enforcement would define.
Okay.
And so in all of trafficking combined, you have a small percentage of child sex trafficking, right? Where there's actually monetary gain from someone buying a child for sexual, whatever it might be.
Right.
Now, what we also look at is overseas child sex buying, which is actually it's a pretty large one. I don't have exact statistics on that one, but the reality is the number one purchaser of things like that, where they'll fly a plane, go over to another country for an advertised child. America's the number one purchaser, and that's a problem, right? So like that's a version of trafficking in and of itself, but it's also you also have a child exploitation side of that as well, where there's a little bit of crossover.
Yeah.
So there's a quick story that I usually like to tell, that an agent with Homeland Security Investigations had told me once, that really helped paint a picture of like a specific version of trafficking that we don't always think about. And so one of those is really where the narcotics epidemic blends in, right? So you have what we would call pimps, right? And then you have prostitutes. What's really great about the last 5 to 10 years has been the shift in how law enforcement views prostitution. These stings and these operations that try to take down prostitution rings, where it used to be locking everybody up. It used to be get the girls, get the guy, get everybody, lock them up. They're all doing illegal activity. They're all criminals. But now there's been a shift because of really good police work and really good investigations and other nonprofits that have helped shed light on this, that the reality is a huge majority of prostitutes don't realize it, but they're being trafficked.
Yeah.
They had been groomed maybe at a young age, maybe even as a teenager or an adult. They were groomed where you could call it Romeo trafficking. A lot of them pretend that they love them and that I'm your man, you're my girl, we're going to take over the world, but you got to sell yourself so we can make money.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, that girl doesn't have access to her social security card. She doesn't have access to her credit cards. Happens to men too, by the way. Happens to the transgender community a lot. They unfortunately are considered a commodity, which is just horrible when it comes to prostitution. And so you have this huge problem on kind of the Romeo side, the Romeo trafficking or prostitution side, which correlate generally. And so I have a really amazing guest that you guys need to interview next. You know, if this kind of rolls into where your listeners really enjoy hearing more about this and want to know more about it, have an excellent person that you guys need to interview. She's a survivor and she is one of the best storytellers I ever met. And she travels the country training law enforcement on how to combat these things. It's amazing. But anyways, I'll introduce you at some point. And so you have a lot of different variations, but the prostitution side has been pretty vast. And so what they now do on the law enforcement side is they now bring what we call victim advocates in with law enforcement during stings, where they can sit separately with the prostitutes or the victims or survivors, however you want to call them, and figure out where their story lines up to if they were trafficked or not. Because many times they don't know that they are, and so they'll be very defensive and they don't want to talk to a cop's a bad guy, like they don't want to deal with them. And so bringing victim advocates along can actually open the eyes of the victim to realize what's happened to them, because many times these victim advocates were prostituted themselves. They were trafficked.
Yeah.
So there's been really good progress in the law enforcement side alongside other NGOs who are doing this type of work. And so it's identified where we think trafficking of somebody getting snatched up off the street, or like, you know, the classic, I call it the classic Target story of
Yeah.
the mom that puts the Facebook post out that says, I was almost trafficked today. And like, okay, like maybe like, and I don't want to downplay your thoughts or your feelings. The reality is there's been like a fraction of confirmed cases that have ever happened like that, ever. Like it doesn't happen that way. And these things where they talk about the zip ties on the cars or talk about the $100 bill or all that, they're likely just trying to rob you.
Yeah.
Like they're probably trying to set you up to steal from you. They're not actually trying to traffic you, because the reality is, sadly, it's easier to traffic them another way.
Yeah.
When you steal a person here stateside, you get a lot of attention on you. You get law enforcement, investigators, family. You get a ton of people coming down on top of you, and there are easier ways to do it, unfortunately. And so the traditional sense of trafficking, what the average citizen or civilian thinks it to be, is so different than what it is now. The quick story I was going to tell you was there was a young lady who she was like from up north in the Midwest somewhere. She went down to Miami with some girlfriends. She's like a young 21-year-old single mother, lives with her mom, and came down to Miami to have some fun with some girlfriends. She met a guy while she was down there at the club. They ended up hanging out for a couple of nights and sleeping together. She flies back home, doesn't know the wiser. And then suddenly she gets hidden video camera of her with him from his phone. And he had been filming them the entire time. And he basically says, if you don't send me $1,000 a week, I know where you live. I know your daughter's name. I know where your mom is. I'll send this to everyone you know. I'll put it on Facebook, whatever it might be, and blackmails this poor girl into what other option does she have? Nobody can bring $1,000 extra in a week. She starts selling herself. And because it's the only way she can do it. And he actually recommends, they suggest that. He's like, dude, here's how you can do it. I'll give you all the tools you need, blah, blah, blah. And during a sting, law enforcement find this girl through an outbound ad on the, whether it's dark web or open web. And they find her, and in their understanding of kind of some of the cues and everything, they're like, we think this is a victim. And when they come, they bring an advocate with them. She breaks down crying, tells them the whole story. They commandeer the phone and pretend to be her long enough to find this guy. They find him, arrest him, get him indicted, all these things. He was doing it to about 18 other girls around the country. And he was living in a penthouse in Miami, living a life. And so that's trafficking. Like that's the stuff that law enforcement are after. It's not the Hollywood version. So hopefully that kind of helps paint a picture of really the big differences. And if anything, like I really hope people understand what real trafficking is as opposed to what Hollywood portrays it to be.
Yeah, that does. Because I mean, like, it's funny you said the movie Taken, right? Because I think that was my first like visual of what I thought
Yeah,
trafficking was. And it doesn't mean that maybe it doesn't happen in that case,
sure,
some,
sure.
some instances, but
Right.
that's what I thought it was. So, I tell my husband, I went to Cancun on spring break as a senior in high school. And I tell my husband, I'm like, our daughter's never doing anything like that, thinking that's
Yeah, yeah.
what's gonna happen,
Well,
right? But
and that's still good. I mean, look, like you still
yeah,
protect your children, you want to keep them safe, and it's good to have uh to be vigilant and to
yeah,
understand your surroundings. But I compare it a lot of times to the serial killer effect. And here's what I mean by that is there are homicides all over the country, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them, every year. But what do you hear about the most? You hear about the ones that catch everyone's attention. It's the serial killer effect. And so the serial killers are the ones that get the stories. They get the Dateline, the CNN, the NBS, all the big names. And then what happens when the beautiful 17-year-old blonde girl goes missing?
right,
National media, right? But that's a very tiny fraction typically of what happens. It's the hundreds of thousands of other stories you never hear
right.
because they're not flashy. So that kind of alludes to your point of the Taken aspect.
Yeah. And is it true that it happens more often in a situation where someone is more vulnerable to that situation happening too?
100%. Yeah. So there's a lot of say 100%, a very large majority, right? So like these vulnerabilities like poverty, single family homes, there usually you've got I would say poverty is probably the biggest driver, but because where there's poverty, there's usually narcotics, there's usually issues of big cities, things like that. But yeah, I would say that just based on what law enforcement has always talked about and subject matter experts have always talked about, there are many vulnerabilities. And like I told you earlier, actually the trans community, LGBTQ
Yeah.
community has a lot of vulnerability in this area because unfortunately, we're in a position where like that tends to be very political
Yes.
and just that very thing. And so a lot of times though that group of people are cast out from everyone, like and they only have a small community they can go to. And what that leads to is isolation generally can lead to that opportunity, right? Especially on the Romeo trafficking side, because people can do those kinds of people who are vulnerable, who don't have community, don't have help, and people around them that can affirm them and encourage them and all those things. So yes, that is 100% true when there are certain vulnerabilities that make them way more susceptible.
And when it comes to, exploitation, the biggest difference, I mean, I think the name kind of says itself, right? But this one, can you dive a little bit deeper into like what would be the biggest difference between these two and where would you most often, I know you had shared some statistics, if I could talk today, with me around this one, which were a little shocking to me. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. So, I always try. I hate to like compare one or the other
Yeah,
in a comparison frame because every victim is a victim regardless.
right.
When we talk about children and we talk about the actual vastness of the problem, because that's what we're dealing with. You want to talk about like real pandemics, like pandemics a very popular word these days. We're under a true pandemic when it comes to child exploitation. Now, trafficking is obviously a major problem,
Yeah,
not downplaying it whatsoever.
yeah,
But most law enforcement experts in this space would tell you that for every trafficked victim, there's a few thousand exploited children online. And so you can see the vastness, right? And I'll share some of those statistics here in a bit. But I think two primary factors to the differences is monetary versus not monetary, right? And you've got a whole group of people who, if they're trafficking human beings and it's true human trafficking, they're in it for the money. Like
right.
that's what they're in it for. Like there's lots of money in it. It's a very big industry, and there's lots of money to be had. The problem is, and this is where it gets really difficult, is with child exploitation. It's more about power. It's more about addiction. It's more about something that is wrong deeply inside of a human, that gives them the ability to act upon those desires. And so you obviously, human trafficking is an evil thing, but it can be easily defined in financial gain. Child exploitation is so much harder to actually discuss because there's a deeply rooted thing happening with mankind, with humanity, right? And it's just horrible. And so one of the really staggering statistics, and here's where sometimes we can struggle with, like, oh, did the internet create this problem, right? The internet emphasized this problem. It gave more opportunity. It did not create the problem. We are, I mean, as you and I know, we're fallen creatures, and we live in a fallen world, and so there's evil and there's sin and there's bad. But most of us would argue this is the evil of evils, right? This is and most subject matter experts in this space, especially on the psychological level, will generally tell you that once an offender offends, once a pedophile offends, there's no going back. And it's almost unheard of for someone to recover from those actions. And again, I'm just telling you what experts say. Like, and there's other people that might argue that, but in our circle and the people that we deal with and the groups that we work with, we often hear that said, that it is very almost unheard of to recover from that. And so I think one of the staggering statistics that with the internet, coming in the early 2000s, really starting to build on itself, they started kind of tracking what we call child sexual abuse material. So like what the general public would refer to as child pornography.
Yeah.
If there's another thing that I would love for your people to understand, is don't use that term. Don't use child pornography. Pornography implies two-party consent,
Right.
and a child can never consent. They can never ever consent. Any parent knows this, right? Any parent understands what it's like to raise a child. They don't know what's best for them.
Mhm.
And they are not fully developed. I mean, gosh, even men, their frontal lobe isn't developed till they're 25 years old, like that. So like, how could you ever expect a child to be able to consent to these things? So we call it child sexual abuse material, not child pornography. And so when NCMEC really started kind of tracking a lot of these things and figuring out what we were looking at back in the early 2000s, so I think really the first report was in 2004, and they were looking at overall about 450,000 files of child sexual abuse material online. So that's 2004. Fast forward to 2022, and we're less than 20 years, and we are at 82 million files of children being sexually abused and raped. And so we truly are at epidemic, pandemic, whatever you want to call it, levels of just the material that exists out there, let alone what doesn't exist or what's happening to children or any of those things. This doesn't even take into play just true child sexual abuse. Like, this is just what's online. So like, you could imagine if this is being memorialized, what we call memorialized online, what's happening elsewhere too. And it's tragic. And so NCMEC since 2002, going back 2 years before that, actually received over 360 million incidents of child rape. They were, since 2002, have received that many incidents, that like actual cases, what you would call them. It's far beyond a singular fix, right? Like, how in the world do you fix this? How did we? It's always the question of how did we get here? And again, we're in a fallen world. We're in a over sexualized world. It's constantly in our face. Whether it's hetero, it doesn't even matter. None of it's not even what the preference is. It's just that sex and pornographic material is shoved down our throat on a daily basis as a culture. And it's, I would venture to say, just personally, not even representing the organization, but personally, that you can draw direct parallels to the immediate access to pornography. If you talk to subject matter experts that deal with children, we're seeing 11-year-olds with erectile dysfunction because of too much pornography. That's a problem. Like, we have an issue, and we got to get to the core of that issue so that we can get into prevention mode. Because if we're at 363 million cases since 2002, I can't even imagine. It's exponentially growing. It increased like 200 to 300% during COVID. It's only going to get worse. We got to stop playing the catch up game and get in a prevention game, right? Like, it's now or never. And our children deserve better than this. And we have to, if we're going to stand on anything as people, it is for the next generation. It's for the sake of our children. And so it's really where that's a huge passion for me. Like, when I first came on, I didn't really know what I was coming into. I just knew that we were going out and rescuing kids and saving, vulnerable people. And I was like, I'm in, just tell me where to go.
Yeah.
And what I quickly realized was I had no idea what was really going on, and no idea the vastness of the issue. And it actually really brought up things from even my own childhood that, I had dealt with and had healed from and had gone through, some trials with. But it kind of brought it, I was like, oh wow, like, this is kind of a full circle moment for me personally. And so this is a very passionate area for me. And so I think that, if we look at, like, okay, we have a huge, vast issue of child exploitation. How do we attack this? That's where we'll talk about it further down in our questions, but that's where Operation Lightshine comes into play, to empower law enforcement for what they actually need, actually equipping them, and then educating parents, educating young kids, educating teenagers. So if we look at the kind of the three E's, that equip, empower, and educate, that's really why we exist. And if any nonprofit or any law enforcement agency or any subject matter expert is telling you that they have all the solutions, they're lying. So I'll never sit here and tell you that we are the singular answer to the problem, right? Because we can't be. This is a global community issue. But we believe that we can have a platform to raise the awareness and begin to point in the directions where an average civilian or average citizen can be involved. It can best help, whether it's financial, whether it's boots on the ground, whether it's a support at the political level. Like, gosh,
Right.
the politics side of this is a whole different ball game. Where, I mean, you saw where Zuckerberg sat in front of on the Senate floor. I mean, he was laughing all the way to the bank. They don't have a clue. They don't even know what Facebook and Twitter and any of those things are, let alone these internet crimes against children. They just don't understand. So we have political partners that are on Capitol Hill that are doing those things. A group called Raven, that's made up of some of the subject matter experts around the country in that space. And so there's so many angles that we have to come at this, that we're not a singular solution. And if your heart is very pulled towards a singular solution, like, hey, I want to be on the recovery side. I want to be, once the child is rescued, what do I do? Right? We can help with that. Like, we can give you a direction to go. We have so many great partners we would love to point you to. It's one area as the development person that I care deeply for, is like, if you're a donor, if you have money to give, I don't want you to just pour it into Operation Lightshine. I want to hear where your heart is. Okay, like, what in fact a part of this fight matters most to you. Let me help guide and direct that, right? Because I believe that with helping our other partners, we're just helping the vastness of the issue. So hopefully that kind of helps paint a picture of the child exploitation side a little bit. There's so many rabbit holes to go down, but that's kind of an overarching theme for it.
It's interesting. Yeah. I think a lot of people would think that the internet has blown this up, which I'm sure 100% has contributed in making things easier for people to have access, right? But yeah, we've discussed, right? This is something that has been around way before the internet was here. My family has dealt with it, in certain ways and shapes and forms, and a lot of them too. And there's what's interesting to me is when you say the statistics, my mind immediately goes, but those are the ones that are reported. How many are not actually reported, right? It's got to be a wildly larger number of the statistics that are not actually reported in there too.
No question. Yeah, that's the hard part to even think about, right? Like, how can we even fathom we already see this massive multi-million, number that we are aware of. And again, that's just the memorialized stuff that we find on the internet. That's not the stuff that's happening in churches, in homes, inside locker rooms, like the things we never hear about. And I can tell you right now, there's been many times where I've shared my personal story with other men,
Right.
and I can tell you that a huge majority of them will suddenly say, I have a similar story,
Hmm.
and they've never told a soul. And
Yeah.
I'm just, how many are out there? And like, because men, as men, we find it difficult to be vulnerable and talk about those things. They're very intimate. Like, that's difficult. And most of us have trauma from it. And so for us, like, I find it very important, especially one-on-one with other men, to actually be very open about it. And nothing specific, just more of like, hey, like, I dealt with this thing, and this is how it affected my life. This is where I found healing and recovery. And I mean, some of them will end up in tears and just say, like, I've never told anyone this, but that's me.
Right.
And so I find it, and then we stay, and then we're lifelong friends. And then it's suddenly there's a direct connection. And I've been so fortunate to have open resources for things like this where I can point them to it.
Right.
We've got to have those resources.
Yeah, it's interesting you say men too, right? Because we talk about this a lot, and people, I think, assume women, but they forget that this does happen to men and boys and things too. And a lot of times, I think probably a lot of those unreported statistics are probably boys and men because
Wouldn't surprise me at
there
all.
is, yeah, there's a lot of shame and things that come along with not wanting to share those kinds of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So you talked a little bit about the government and some of this becoming a political thing. So talk to me about, from a government standpoint, if I'm in that sort of a setting, right? All I'm thinking is, oh my gosh, we have to do something about this, especially being a mom, right? But what does the government currently do, like from a federal standpoint, when it
Sure.
comes to these subjects?
Yeah, so I like to give credit where credit's due. I never want to be in a singular position with blinders on, as if they're not doing anything right. I mean, that we can look at, it's just that, federal government's so easy to point at. I mean, it's the
Yeah.
easiest thing in the world to point at and say, look at you, you're terrible. And yeah, in many ways they are.
Yeah.
So that's why, it's even matter of fact why we exist, because we fill the void between what they do provide and what is actually needed. And so a couple of things. So last year, and this not, again, not to point a negative light in them, but this at least gives you an understanding of some of the things they are doing. So last year it was reported that over $40 billion, so 40 with a B, was spent by the federal government on the war on drugs. So narcotics, right? And I think most of our listeners could say they're not winning that war right now, right? Like, it's very like we're losing that one. And yet we're pouring billions, and it will go up a billion every year, by the way. It'll go up to 41 this year, it'll go to 42. They only spent 200 million on both child exploitation and human trafficking combined for the whole country. If you do the rough math on that, that's about a million per major city in the US. And as you know, that's a drop in the bucket. That's nothing. That goes away in an evening, right? And so we have a huge disparity. Like, Matt, even if they moved a couple of billion to that, it would make a huge difference. So groups like Raven are up on Capitol Hill talking about that. They're bringing that to the forefront, and what they're doing is they're trying to act as the true experts for politicians, so that when they get up and they lobby for this, and they get up in front of their constituents and they discuss this, they have Raven in their corner to help them in presenting this information. Because again, just like me, I'm not a subject matter expert, but I've had a lot of really great people who can help me discuss these things with the right people. And so I think that there's a lot of hope of things to come, but as we all know how slow the government does move, and laws take years, which again, none of us can make sense of it, right? We're all kind of like, why would it ever take this long? But so 200 million is being given. They do fund organizations like NCMEC. They do fund organizations like ICAC, right? So International Center for a Miss, or no, ICAC. I'll get what that acronym is in a second. I'm really embarrassed I don't know it. But ICAC's a great organization. That's a government funded organization. It's made up of law enforcement officials. And what NCMEC does is pass their leads off to ICAC, right? So like the ICAC commanders is what we call them. Generally, every state has one. What they do is then they partner with other organizations, other agencies, and help divvy out those tips and those leads. Now, 363 million incidences since 2002. Do you really think that one agent per state can handle everything?
We're not even close.
With
Yeah,
a couple hundred million, a year to divvy out to everyone, like it's not even close, right? Like you need 15, 20 agents just for ICAC per state just to help with all of the information. It's overwhelming. I mean, you can ask ICAC commanders, they go home with stacks of cases this high every night, like of children they can't get to. And they're divvying out and they're putting in, even they'll tell you like, and then we have to pass it off to an agent we know can't handle it.
right,
It's like, and it's just, it's a hard system, and they're doing incredible work. I mean, they're doing God's work. It's just they're overwhelmed. They don't have the support they need. And so the issue that you have government doing something, but it's so minimal compared to the vastness of the problem. Um, and so I think where we stand is we're grateful for what's been done, but there needs to be a massive overhaul, and it needs to happen way, way fast, like yesterday fast. And unfortunately, we're just in a position where we know that's just not going to happen. It's happening slightly faster because we have groups like Raven and we have political partners, but it's just going to be a slow process. And just like anything else, by the time things get updated, the bad guys have advanced.
right,
They're already further along. I mean, we look at the opportunity that artificial intelligence is bringing now. We are screwed. Like
right,
we truly like there's so much that's going to happen with AI in the next 5 to 10 years, and politicians are just catching up on the regular internet capabilities. So
right.
it's just, and again, privatized money versus government money. It's the way it's always going to be.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to knock, federal government at all. I'm just saying that it's an overhaul that has to happen in order for action to take place immediately. And I would love for them to hear this. I would love for them to hear like, hey, act now or our children are screwed. We got to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary to see how fast. I mean, I remember the internet just coming around when I was young, right? And it's scary to see how fast it has developed since then
Yeah.
to everything that we can do on our phone. And I feel like I know a pretty good amount, and I still feel like I'm behind on some of those things. So I
Same.
can imagine how
Same.
fast a lot of this can grow too. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So there's a subject that we haven't talked about, and I have never actually heard this term before, but can you explain what is sextortion and dive
Sure. Yeah.
into it?
Yeah. So sextortion is a very interesting crime type. Sextortion, and the reason why I make this a singular line item is because it has a little bit of a blend between trafficking and child exploitation.
Yeah,
Um, Sextortion is basically the act of an offender gaining access to a child, typically electronically. Actually, it's generally always electronically, tricking them into believing that they are someone they're not. Generally, it's someone that child's age. So, like, from who, I've seen 8-year-olds with cell phones now. So, from 8 years old to 18, right? You've got opportunity for offenders to reach your child. They pretend as if they are the child's age. They befriend them, work into a relationship, and then they convince them to send explicit material to them of the child themselves, right? I don't know if you recently saw this absolute befuddle of a law enforcement situation where a child had been groomed by an older man. She was 11 years old. She had sent photos of herself. Law enforcement came knocking on the door of the parent and claimed that the child had created child pornography and she could be arrested. Absolute debacle, right? When I was watching it, I wanted to reach through the screen. Like I could not believe what I was seeing.
yeah,
And that goes into another sector of the training capability, the training capacity for law enforcement. They oftentimes, especially if you're not a detective that specializes in this crime, you sometimes don't know how you're supposed to treat these cases.
right.
That 11-year-old cannot create child sexual abuse material. She was coerced, she was tricked, And she's a minor. She can't create that stuff. Like that's a whole conversation in of itself. But that recently happened. It was a viral video that went around, and that's a sextortion case. It's where a groomer, an offender, groomed that child into sending them something. They teeter on the line of monetary and non-monetary. So sometimes you have people that just want more material.
Right.
So they'll convince the kid, hey, send me that, or I'm sending what you just sent me to your mom, your dad, your cousin. They research the child. So they use open source intelligence, social media, Google search. They actually find everything they need about the child. They know the pastor's name, the principal's name of the school they go to, and they basically trick the child into thinking they're going to do that. And so the child is then stuck with one of two solutions. They either tell mom and dad, or they keep giving what the person's asking for. And a huge majority of the time, the child continues to give the offender what they're asking for. We do see a huge monetary part of this. Actually, teenage boys are being targeted on this. So you probably remember the whole like scams on the email you would get about the Zimbabwe prince that needed $20,000 to get out of the country. So that's an entire crime organization on the Ivory Coast. And they are actually they've shifted their gears towards extortion, and they are targeting teenage boys, and they're pretending to be female girls. And there's some, I don't want to make up a statistic, but there was something I read recently about boys within the first 15 to 20 minutes are very likely to show their entire body within 15 to 20 minutes of someone they've never met. And because they're little boys, they don't know, they're just dumb. Like, I mean, unfortunately, they're thinking with not their normal brain. And so these crime organizations know this. They target them on purpose because they know that they can gain monetary things from them. And the kids will steal from their parents. They'll go out and they'll find money elsewhere. They'll do whatever it takes. We have an issue of children killing themselves, committing suicide over this. And so right now, in 2016, the cyber tip line, it's actually an organization called Cyber Tip Line. They received nearly 300,000 reports of this type of enticement on minors in 2016. So since 2016, so you can imagine how much it's grown. Right. Between 2019 and 2021, it has doubled. The reports have doubled. 1 in 4 of those victims are under the age of 14. So we can now say we have a problem with this, right? We have too young to own these, too young to use them.
Yes.
And it is a massive, massive issue and a simple fix, right? Like it, and again, like most times what you have in one of our law enforcement partner on our team, Jim Cole, who's one of the world's leading subject matter experts in this space, he makes the joke all the time that kids are like inmates. He was like, if you take a cell phone away, they'll find one. Like it's a dopamine thing. Like it's actually like a narcotic for them. They have to have it. And so we hear reports all the time of children going over to friends' parents' house and finding an old cell phone and hooking it up and connecting to Wi-Fi and talking to that same offender. And so they find a way. So the solution isn't to it's not necessarily to just take the cell phone away. Like you might actually cause a lot more damage. The solution is to, if you can avoid it, wait as long as you can to introduce a cell phone. If you've already done it, then we'll talk about that. But if you haven't done it yet and you're thinking about it, wait as long as you possibly can. And then if you can't wait any longer, you go buy one of those phones like Gabb, G-A-B-B, that is it's a phone for children that has protection mechanisms and encryptions and all these great safety features. You don't go get them a regular cell phone. You certainly don't get them open access to the internet and social media. And I would venture to say that 60 to 70% of parents don't have a clue. Their children know more about the internet than they do. And so we have some simple fixes and simple solutions that honestly could solve 50% of this issue. But parents don't know about it. They don't know that when they gave their kid this, and that kid is alone in their bedroom, that creepy, horrible, evil men have direct access now to their child in their bedroom.
Yeah.
That's real. That's not hyperbole. That's not fake. That is real. And parents need to hear that if they hear anything else, because you'd never let that happen in person. You'd never let some creepy person into your child's bedroom with a shut door. You wouldn't let it go down. So why are we treating this any differently? We have to get to the thought that the days of the shady candy van hanging out by the playground, those days aren't, that stranger danger. Like, that's not what we're dealing with now. It might be a small percent. This is what we're dealing with now. And guys, the bad guys, offenders, they go where children go, and children are on these Roblox, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, you name it, any of the platforms, not just a few of them, but all of them.
Yes.
Offenders will go there. Video games, Xbox, PlayStation, offenders will befriend your child because your child's getting picked on through the mic. Someone's talking bad about them because they suck. And they'll loop around, private message that child and say, hey man, you don't suck. You're awesome. No big deal. And next thing you know, that's a friend, that's a best friend that they've never met. And that's a 38-year-old man that they don't know. And so that is the sextortion side that parents have to be so aware of. And it is a true issue. I think last year, our task force, or in the last 12 months, our task force in Nashville was reporting between 6 and 7 cases a week just in Middle Tennessee. So you can imagine how much bigger it really is.
I've had this conversation many times with moms, and I said, hand on the Bible, my daughter and my son will not get a phone until they are minimum 16 years old and need one for driving. And at that point, it will only be a phone that they can text or they can call on. There will be no internet access. And I've had people say, like, well, you said this. And I'm like, no, this is not about what I said. I was not going to feed my kid, right? Or like, something along those lines. This is a much bigger deal than just them having a social media account. I was like, I have a social media account because I use it for my business and it's rarely used personally. And I see what goes on just from that standpoint. And I also see from a personal standpoint as a almost 37-year-old woman, how difficult it can be to take myself off of that. Right. And I can get on to do something for work and then I'm on there for 30 plus minutes. So it's interesting. You said the dopamine effect too. There's a really good book called Dopamine Nation that dives deep into how addictive those things can be. And when you have a young brain that is not developed and does not emotionally know how to handle those kinds of situations, it's scary what can happen. My daughter was riding the bus and one of our neighbor girls came home and they're in kindergarten and she's telling her mom, oh, I got to watch this video on the bus. And she's like, how did you watch the video? And she's like, a third grader on the bus had a phone and is showing my daughter videos on the bus. And I'm like, how does a third grader get a phone? And I understand, it's a difficult conversation to have as a parent. It's tough to be the one that's telling your kid no. But when you understand the other things that could be happening on the other end of that, it's not that hard of a conversation to have.
Oh, I totally agree. I think that you hit the nail on the head about the child on the bus too, that they don't even own a cell phone. But because so many parents are on different pages about this topic, it's almost inevitable that you face it, that your child's going to come across it. And that's where you have early introduction of pornography. That's where you have like at way too young of an age, like there's all these issues that come up with that. And so, I typically try to tell parents, like with the subject matter experts I've dealt with that have given me parental insight and help, is that to keep open dialogue with your children always, right? Even as young as 5. I've already had to talk to my 5-year-old about who's allowed to touch his private area. And we actually call it what it is. We'll call it penis, so that he doesn't have some kind of nickname for it, so that when he tries to sound the alarm and someone thinks, well, what's he talking about? We want people to know what he's talking about. And so to have, and that's taboo especially for me coming from a Southern Christian culture. It's like when my kid says penis at church, like everyone, oh no. And it's like, we don't care. We want him to be open about that stuff and understand how important it is to have open dialogue with him of like, hey, buddy, like if anything like X, Y, and Z ever happens to you, you can always talk to mommy and daddy. You're not in trouble. Like you're not in trouble ever about those things. And we want him to be aware because again, like I was 5 years old. I was 5 years old.
Yeah.
My parents were amazing parents, amazing parents. I would rather not have any other parents except for mine. And yet that this was not known to them about this type of crime or about this type of issue or whatever it might be. And I was in a very safe place when it happened. And these are all factors that we have to look into of like, now that we're aware, now that we know, we have to have conversations with our children very young, because it's can't think of it as taboo anymore. It is normal. So yeah, that's the advice I would give to parents in that regard.
The other area I see things come up too is a conversation around sleepovers with kids and things as well.
Hard one. That's a hard one.
I did them all the time as a kid. Um, there was no internet access though, when I was young, and I still saw things I shouldn't have seen, at a young age.
Yep.
We have had that conversation of there are no sleepovers. Kids are allowed to come here if they want to, but our kids are not sleeping over anywhere else unless it's someone related to
That's
the.
our house rule as well too. The only houses they're allowed to stay the night at are their grandparents.
Yeah.
And with no other guests there while they're there, right? Like it's just them sleeping with their grandparents.
Yeah.
And it's because we know our grandparents, because again, like if you think about this, and people are like, what if your grandparents are offenders? If your grandparents were offenders, they would have offended you.
Right.
You would have had a very different childhood, right? And because the reality is it's people don't really become offenders overnight. People don't suddenly have this inkling, especially in their grandparent stage. Like that's not a thing typically. So for my parents, they were very protective of me and watched over me, and nothing like that ever happened with them. So I trust my children with them. Same thing with my wife and her family. So we've made that hard line. That's a hard decision. That's a really tough choice of, I mean, because we've got siblings that we love and we trust, but it's really just a hard line that we kind of have to ride, because if we open it further in the circle just keeps getting bigger of who we allow it for, and it's an area we cannot compromise. I cannot, I would not sleep all evening, knowing that my child is somewhere that I didn't necessarily fully trust and know. And even if I fully trusted and knew, like I have to be so cautious. So we just draw the line pretty hard. So
On the subject of parents and protecting their children, educating themselves, one area I can say, I tell my husband, I'm like, I thank God I grew up with parents that were as strict as they were. I hated it when I was a teenager, and we did not
exactly.
get along that great when I was a teenager. But I know I would have been down a way worse path if my parents were not as strict as they were. But the one thing I've always said, I wish that there was more conversation around the strictness, around why some of those rules were in place. And I've said I would be very open with our daughter about things that have happened to me because of choices that, situations I was put in or things along those lines. And because I do want her to understand, right? And regardless, it may not mean that as a 16-year-old girl that she's going to love me for the rules that I'm putting in place, but what are ways that parents can, maybe help protect a little bit more, educate themselves, or even have those conversations better?
Yeah, so I think so in direct resources, we actually have a really great partner, and I'll send you some links when we get done with the call so that you can post about them and such. But they have a really great partner. It's actually here in Nashville locally. Her name is Hannah George. She founded what's called Filter First.
Yeah.
She's a mother of six. She began to notice the cell phone issue early on, and she was way ahead of the curve and started developing with other subject matter experts curriculum. She worked with law enforcement, worked with federal law enforcement, like pretty high level stuff, and actually helped build curriculum that would teach like in that kind of fourth grade to sixth, seventh, eighth grade type age,
Yeah.
really kind of before they hit the high school stage. And so she created this curriculum that's peer to peer. It's kids talking to kids. It's older teenagers talking to younger kids that they look up to and respect.
Right.
Parents telling kids this is really difficult, as you know. Trying to convince them of what you know and what they're willing to accept is a very fine line.
Right.
And so having material that's actually peer-to-peer kids talking to kids is super effective. So she actually has a lot of her material in a bunch of different schools, and there's a couple of school systems that are test piloting it, hoping to actually broaden this to the whole district. And so that's one of our really close partners. We're very directly tied together. We really we utilize them really as a piece of our education wing. So if we go back to the 3 E's, that's a really important part, is having her alongside us, and a very, very important partner for us. And so, and again, I'll send you more information on that, but that's a really kind of just direct resource that parents can use. It's like $10, and it's like you can, and it's digital. You can buy it online, and it's like little 5-minute videos to
Yep.
talk to your kid. It's super helpful. And then so, another way that I would recommend, just as a parent, is just having direct connectedness with your child. It's very similar to how you just talked about the conversation component.
Yeah.
My when it comes to my parents personally, my mom was really good at conversation. She was very, and what's interesting is both of my mom and dad have childhood trauma.
Yeah.
Some very horrible childhood trauma, as a matter of fact. And for my dad, I think that he struggled because he never had anyone emulate what that conversation should look like. He even now would admit he relied heavily on my mom to help in that communication. As I've gotten older and become an adult, like my dad and I's communication is so much better, and we can communicate clearly now, and it's healthy and good. But I think not being afraid of what you'll hear. I think a lot of parents are afraid of, when they ask questions, what's going to come out of their kids' mouths. And like that's the issue. And what we really have to stay away from is shaming.
Yeah.
And I come from a Christian home, right? That's how we operate our home. And so, in the Christian faith, we oftentimes struggle with condemnation. We struggle with, oh my gosh, that's so bad. How could you ever do that? Blah, blah. The Lord has brought me on a journey personally of having done it all and still having redemption. And
Yes.
so I was the prodigal son, right? And so I've been very fortunate, even though it was a horrible experience of chasing the world. I look at what God did, and now I can be more empathetic with my child as he goes through things and as he experiences things. And I want to keep it an open book of like, hey, like, I just want to let you know, like, there's probably nothing you're going to go through that I haven't been through, and difficulty and bad decisions and all these things. Just come to me and talk. Like, I'm never going to condemn you. I'm never going to shame you. You might face consequences, because there's consequences to your actions. There should be, but my love for you is never going to change based on what you tell me. And I think parents have to do a better job at that, right? Like, hey, I don't care what it is, just always come home.
Yeah.
Always call, always come home, and never think that for a second we're going to condemn you or punish you. Like, of course, punishing is different than condemning.
Right.
But I think that we can do a better job as parents of keeping that line of communication open, and stop letting these raise our kids. Like, just stop. Like stop putting a screen in front of them. That is, if I could say one thing, to your listeners: be engaged with your children, have healthy engagement with your children, so that they're confident and comfortable enough. Like, we're watching an entire generation being raised on these. Like,
Yeah.
it's happening. I mean, you look around a restaurant and you see kids with laptops and iPads and phones, and that's all. And the parents are sitting there talking, or the parents are on their phones,
Yeah.
and the child is in. And I understand, like, there's a time and a place. Like, we're not anti screen time necessarily. Like, we think a lot of screen time is very educational and helpful. My
Yeah.
wife homeschools our oldest son, and she uses screen time for education and certain specific things, but she has a very hard line of how much screen time, right? And so I think that that's really where a primary struggle is for us as parents, is we are so reliant on these to as a help, because it's so easy to just throw a screen in front of them. And we are damaging our children with this.
100%. It is. It's a hard line to face. I mean, we have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I get it. I get the days where you are just tapped out and
Done.
yeah. Um, but I've also noticed, because my job is on my phone, I also notice the times that I am most on edge with my kids is when I am on my screen way too much, and I need to put it down and just be present.
100%. I
Yeah.
could not agree more with that.
Yeah. Okay, talk to me about Operation Lightshine. What does Operation Lightshine do when it comes to a lot of these, issues and concerns to help combat it?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, Operation Light Shine really primarily exists with the for the Intercept Task Force. So if we look at kind of like, okay, what is first of all, what does Intercept stand for? Intercept is the Interagency Child Exploitation and Persons Trafficking Task Force. That's an absolute mouthful, right? But that's for us, it's the capability to tackle both human trafficking and child exploitation, because even though those crimes are very different, law enforcement utilize the very similar resources to combat it. Into the investigative side, digital forensics, a lot of that's used in unison for this crime type. So when you can create a task force that does both, most of your resources you pour into it are going to help tackle both. So the Intercept task force is very different than your typical task force. So a typical task force is where several different types of agencies. It could be all federal, it could be all local, or it could be a mixture of both with state. But generally speaking, task forces are run and managed by or owned by a single agency. So you usually have like a DEA task force, you have an FBI task force, you have a Homeland Security task force. Like, the agency makes the decisions and the other agencies are just assisting them in that way. Difference in this is that every agency involved in a task force has an equal seat at the table. So instead of having one singular agency or three-letter agency kind of calling the shots and making the plays, you have everybody that has a seat at the board of that task force specifically. So the sheriff or the chief, whoever it might be, has a position, a chair at that table. And they can appoint it to their undersheriff or whoever they want to, but someone sits at the table and they meet monthly and they discuss their cases and how they operate and all the things they do. And the priority goes to each agency's county or district. So they're not having to go fight crimes in the other county. They can actually prioritize their own. So it doesn't take away resources from that local county, because that's usually what can happen in a task force traditionally, is that the emphasis on whatever agency owns the task force, they then pull resources from other agencies that they don't have the resources for to give. So we give an equal playing field to everyone, and everyone gets to share the statistics. And the reason why that's important is because then you get municipal support and political support and funding because of your statistics as a county or a city or whatever it might be. So it's not one agency, because like if it's an FBI task force or an HSI task force, they get the stats. All the agencies get to share the stats of the rescues, convictions, indictments, etc. And so you're empowering, you're really force multiplying. You're not taking away resources. And that's why so many law enforcement agencies have jumped on this, because they're just like, this is a huge opportunity where we don't have to give up something, but we gain so much more. Because really, if they join a task force of 7 other agencies, they now have 15, 20 officers and detectives that can jump on something with them in a response. It's massive. And so that's a huge component that's very different. The other component is we try to put every gambit of the investigation within the same building, within the same space. So from the investigation side, with the detectives actually doing the detective work, then we have an in-house digital forensics lab and the team in there that does digital forensics. Then we have prosecutors, both state and federal, that are in the same building. So you have from stuff getting found to extracting evidence to handing the evidence over, and they're all operating together. It's not ad hoc. It's not different buildings. It's not having to make phone calls and drives and all this stuff. So much more can happen and especially quickly, because when a child is on the line, you want to know that all your players are there, and then you can collaborate and you can work together. And when you do stuff like, I mean, this cross collaboration, you can't put a dollar sign on it. It means everything. Right. And so having them in the same building is truly a force multiplier and not ad hoc. And so on the digital forensics side, that's probably, I mean, just personally, I would argue that that's one of the most important ones, because you can't, if you don't have the evidence properly pulled and filed and done well, you can't prosecute. If the prosecutor is not, involved in the case already as evidence being pulled and understands it and can kind of start brainstorming it, and can say, hey, that's, that I can get that across the finish line. Then once it gets in their hands and it's all that work's been done and the prosecutor's like, hey, I can't use this, it's a waste of everyone's time, right? So having the digital forensics side really buttoned up and having it on site and and focused on this crime type, because that's what happens a lot of times is most major cities have a couple of digital forensics labs in them. They focus on every crime type. Like, so everyone's cell phones and laptops and iPads are all going here for all sorts of different crimes.
Right.
And you have 9 to 12 month backlogs, like where people can't get their evidence out of the evidence room. You can't prosecute. Guys are walking around on bail having just raped a child because we can't get the evidence out of the evidence room. And so you have, where we want to focus is taking that digital forensics lab, making it the most state of the art thing you possibly can so that it is fast, it is in and out and in the prosecutor's hands. And we've pulled a lot of things together to help do that. And so, for instance, I'll give you a quick story. There's a technology known as Magnet Forensics is a company, a very close friend of the organization, and they have a technology called Magnet Automate. And these guys who started Magnet, it's actually a bunch of detectives that focused on this crime type with CSAM, with child sexual abuse material, and they're just brainiacs. And they started this company to help create something for law enforcement because they knew the disparity they were under. And so when they built Magnet Automate to help plug into the forensics side. Because on the forensic side, as you can imagine, if you get a cell phone and there's 10,000 files on it,
Right.
the time it takes for you to extract and organize and do all this hours and hours and hours of work on one case,
Right.
and they've got cases up to the ceiling.
Right.
So they created Magnet Automate to actually do the administrative work to pull that data 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, all day long. And they've got 5 of them inside of their digital forensics lab. We talked to Metro Nashville, who's a partner of ours, Metro Nashville PD. They had actually already invested in this before we even heard about it, because they presented it to us. They're like, "Hey, this is a tool y'all need."
Yeah.
And Chad Gish is a really good friend of ours. He leads the forensics lab there for homicides and internet crimes against children. And Chad was in a backlog, and I don't want to misquote him, but he told me, I'm pretty sure he told me it was going to take him 2 to 3 years to get out of the backlog. He was like, I get one done and 10 more come in. He was like, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. He was, I mean, he was probably, I mean, to be honest, if I was him, I would have quit.
Yeah.
I don't want to subject myself to that and like know that I'm never going to get out of it and children are waiting on me.
Yeah.
And so when they invested in Magnet Automate and plugged it in, he got out of that backlog in 3 months.
Jeez.
3 months. He is now, for the first time, waiting on cases. For the first time ever in his career, is waiting on cases to come in. And so the power of that alone, that piece of technology alone that we invest in, because like imagine going to your government and asking them for $150,000.
Right.
One, they're gonna say no, and they're gonna laugh at it, or they're gonna say, well, like, hey, it's gonna be a couple of years, and it's like by the time they get it, your cases are already stacked up. So what we do is we fill the gap. We come in and we say, all right, we need Magnet Automate in this lab now. And we go out, we fundraise for it, we bring it in and we install it, and we bring Magnet in, they do the whole thing. So that's just one piece of technology that we pull in to enhance these task forces. And most of our law enforcement, we're actually about to do a pretty big campaign of law enforcement stories. They're going to be telling their stories, talking about Operation Light Shine, why it's so important. And you're going to hear many of them say their productivity going up 200 to 300%. They're like, I am far light years further in my productivity of getting cases done than I've ever been. And that to us is worth everything we do. It's worth everything. And so yeah, so that's on the technology side, the equipping, obviously the empowering. So it's empowering 2 different people. It's empowering our law enforcement. Traditionally, law enforcement have been, if you look around the country and you do a poll of how many agents are actually, combating this type of crime, it's a very small percent, where there's at least one narcotics detective in every agency around the country, but you rarely have a child exploitation detective. And so when you find one, traditionally they're down in a closet somewhere in a filing room by themselves looking at child sexual abuse material all day. They live in a hell, a literal hell.
Yeah.
And because nobody else wants to deal with it, and nobody else really wants to be around them because it's horrible. And so, but if we can take them and we can team them up with a task force, and then we get them a chance to tell their story, then these law enforcement are going to come out of the closets and come out of the broom closets and say, hey, like I'm doing this too. And you create a whole network of men and women who are going to war on this stuff. And you create a huge web of connectivity amongst these agents. And so you're empowering them and giving them a chance to tell their story and to show the world what a real hero looks like not some celebrity. Like you get a chance to sit them on a platform that they otherwise would never get, because many of them have been doing it for years and have never received recognition. And so we want to empower them, right? We also want to empower survivors, and that's a really tricky one because there's two components to that. Is one, we want to make sure they're on the right side of their healing journey first. We never want to put them under stress or under a PTSD situation where it triggers more emotion and more issues and trauma. And two, we never want to exploit the already exploited. We pay our survivors. We pay them to tell their stories and discuss these things, because if we don't, we're no good. We're no better than their exploiters. So for their story and their experience, we want to reward them, give them what they deserve, so that they can have a chance to, like I told you earlier, talk about what they've dealt with, and that one person hears their story and comes forward. That one person then suddenly says, hey, that's me. And where they otherwise never would have done it. And we have a pretty good social platform, what we feel is a pretty vast reach. And we want to give that opportunity to our survivors who want to and who are on the right side of their healing, and have an opportunity to bring other survivors to the fold, to get resources, not so that we can continue to gain more survivors in our network. It's so that we can give them the resources they need. Matter of fact, we had a survivor we met recently who is a mother of several children who had been through child sexual abuse from her own father. And she wanted to help desperately. She was like, I want to help you guys. And but she, in talking to us and a couple other people that were, at that meeting, she said, I still have healing to do. And she didn't even really necessarily think she did. She thought that maybe she was over it. But that's why we want to have good open conversations with them, with subject matter experts who have dealt with this, so that they know where they stand as a survivor. Like, hey, like, you may not be ready. You may think you are, but you may not be ready. Right. And so, but that's a part of the empowering too. And then the education, we've already talked a lot about that. But the education for children and for parents, it's if we're serious about it, that's the preventable measure we can take. So those are kind of our the mission statements, if you will, kind of like the reason why we exist. But the Intercept Task Force is really where, when people are donating to us, those resources are going directly to law enforcement. It's an honor to be able to give them what they need to force multiply.
We kind of talked about this earlier too, how there's, there seems to be like a domino effect with a lot of these different things that can come into play. And obviously there's a lot of things that are contributing, right? It's not just one singular issue. There's a lot of things that can come into play when it comes to this. But I think one of the things that I love most about what you guys are doing is you're focusing in the US, where we already discussed a lot of the consumption of this is happening here, right? So if you can focus here, then that's a huge thing. What are other ways that people can help out, with what Operation Lightshine is doing? Or you had mentioned if people are called to different areas, what's the best way to help support?
Absolutely. So, I think obviously the most effective way to support is to donate, obviously, because as you can imagine, it's very expensive. This technology is not cheap. We actually will do what we call salary replacements too for agencies that need it. So where an agency says, hey, we want in, but we can't afford to peel off a detective to go there. Well, we tell them, hey, that's fine. What you can do is you can hire another patrolman. Then you can actually bring a patrolman up to detective, and then you can fill that detective role into the task force. And we will backfill with a salary replacement for that patrolman they hired. So we'll actually write a check to an agency, and it's really just for local, because you can't do that for federal. Some state can do it, some can't. But being able to give them that, that's like a direct in their budget line item money to hire another agent. And right now we're in a situation where law enforcement is having a hard time hiring anyone, because they don't have the money to do it, because of really what the general public has done to demonize them, which is a separate conversation. But that's another component too, and that can cost anywhere from 80,000 to 100,000 roughly to fill that detective role. We
Yeah.
actually we donate a squad car too, so that they're not out something from their inventory. So as you can imagine, things get relatively expensive, and so that's our first part of the mission, is to be able to provide them really and fill in the gaps where they have a massive disparity of being able to save children. Um, the other components here, so our education partners, so people like Filter First, well, that's another area that when you donate to an education, or you donate to, hey, like I want to give a certain amount to this, or hey, I want to be involved in spreading the word to my local school. So like you may have a direct contact to a school system, and you may say, hey, this stuff is really, really important. I want my school system to be involved with this. Making those introductions, those are huge. Like being able, because again, if we're going to be serious, we have to get in front of children for prevention.
Yes.
And we believe we have a direct line for that, but it's a matter of introductions to those school systems. Even if it's a private, like private schools are great. Those are usually, honestly, very easy. There's not a lot of red tape you got to go through. But yeah, anything like that where you can introduce a school system to the education side is big. Being a ground soldier for your area. So like, I know you said, talking about kind of localized effort, really stateside, but even more specifically down to your region, right? So sorry, let me, and so even specific to your region, having power players or community leaders or politicians or law enforcement agencies that you have influence with in your area, introducing them to what we're doing is a really, really huge deal. I can't tell you how many opportunities have opened up, really grassroots efforts of people catching the vision, understanding what Light Shine is doing, and saying, you know what, I actually have one of my best friends is chief of police here. One of my best friends has a heart for children and owns a couple hospitals. He's a very wealthy individual. I know that he can get behind something like this. And so being a ground soldier, they're kind of organized, because one of the things that we really look for when we first are coming into a region to potentially open a task force, we look for a champion. And a champion can look like a civilian. It can look like an agency. It can look like a politician. It doesn't really matter. They come in all shapes and sizes. But really being really a champion for this goes a very long way. And guess what? When you can champion that movement and you create momentum and you make introductions to us,
Yeah.
it's only a matter of time till we plant a task force there in your town. And the next thing you know, your town is 10 times safer when it comes to your children going up there. We've got people in California right now. California's got its own issues and everything. We got people in small cities there that are working like that are ground soldiers, people in Arizona that are ground soldiers that are building momentum for this. And look, I'll talk to anyone. You can be anybody in the world. I will talk to you and help share the vision and figure out some action steps. So like, if your listeners are curious, like, hey, like, what are some action steps? Like, help me brainstorm. My line is open, my email's open. I'm happy to talk to anyone about how we can get the ball rolling and help them kind of whiteboard, like, hey, I'm very passionate about this. I'm not a natural networker. I'm not really sure what direction to go. I'm not really sure what direction to go. Tell me what to do. And
Yeah.
and I'm more than happy to help them. So those are a few ways. If your passion is on the recovery side, like if you say like, hey, I want to be on the side of kind of boots on the ground for the children when they're found and rescued. So you have a couple of organizations we partner with that are fantastic. One is Crisis Aid International. Crisis Aid is made up of ex-law enforcement with advocates, and they kind of combine their efforts to come alongside families. Unfortunately, oftentimes the abuse is familial, meaning that dad is removed from the home suddenly overnight, and the mom had never had a clue and now doesn't know what to do with her three children. This group comes alongside them. This group walks that journey, because the other thing that law enforcement will do is they'll take all the technology out of the home. Now you're a mom with no cell phone and laptop because it's evidence now. So Crisis Aid will come in and give them a cell phone, give them a laptop, and help them recover some of their contacts from their phone while it's in evidence. And like just practical things you would never really think about. going to the grocery for them, like just these very practical things to help these families. And this organization has walked alongside children from the age of 6 all the way till they graduate high school. Like they are there for the long haul. And they're throughout the country. Matter of fact, they're opening one in Michigan. There's one, I think, right outside of Grand Rapids, that's coming pretty soon. So that's a great organization. They do awesome work. So if your heart's on the recovery side, I'd love to plug you in with them. The other one is a company or organization called Room Redux. Their stuff is just amazing. So when I tell you what their stuff is, you'll say, how did no one ever think of this? So in familial child sexual abuse, oftentimes the child's bedroom is where the abuse occurred. And so whenever this happens and the offender is taken away, the child is left to never want to return to their bedroom ever again.
Yeah.
Room Redux will come in and in one day will remodel the entire bedroom and we'll repaint it, reshelve it, put new beds in there and all these, and take the passions of the child and kind of make the room into that.
Yeah.
And then when the child gets home, the room's done. And the reports they get back from the parents are just beautiful about the child has not left their room since you redid it. The child is sleeping in their room again for the first time in 2 years. Like just beautiful, beautiful recovery process for these kids. And Room Redux is like that. I mean, and that's a really cool boots on the ground because as a civilian, you can go volunteer for the remodel team. Like you can actually show up and help, repaint and drywall and, do whatever. And they welcome anyone to be able to help them. And they generally have no issue pulling people together because it's a mission that people are like, oh man, like that's a no-brainer. And so they actually are just opening a chapter in Nashville. And I'm super excited to be a part of that team and jump in with any of those opportunities to help rebuild those rooms. So there are situations like that where if you're more on the recovery side, that's where your heart is, we've got plenty of those resources too.
I love that. And I will share all of those links and options for people in the show notes. So if you are listening, they are all there for you that you can go and research and figure out where your heart is called to go to. This was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of this today. I know we can have a lot more conversations around this too, so we probably will.
No, yeah,
Um,
totally. And I'm happy to, as I said earlier, bring in subject matter experts, but kind of based on questions. When this gets aired, you may have a lot of questions that come up, and I'd love to, based on those questions, pull the right person in to really help answer those. And we have no shortage of subject matter experts who can do that for y'all. So we would love to do that.
Yeah, perfect. When this does air, if you guys have any questions or anything along those lines, please feel free to reach out, comments, things that you want to share. Love to hear from you. And we'll continue this conversation, pending what you guys are asking and what you'd like to hear more of too. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate you guys.
Bye.